A woman is fined in court for wearing a cross around her neck. But what happens next turns the entire courtroom on its head. Let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from today. Remove the necklace or leave my courtroom. You are not here to make a statement of faith. The gavel hadn't even touched the desk when Judge Fenwick barked those words, his jaw stiff with the kind of authority that made people sit straighter. The courtroom, modest in size but heavy with tension, went eerily still. All eyes darted toward the front row, toward the woman in the tailored navy pantsuit and soft, unbothered eyes. Alice Clinton did not flinch. She reached gently for the small gold cross around her neck, not to hide it but to hold it. Her fingers curled around the pendant like it was more than jewelry. It was a reminder of every hard lesson, every door slammed, every time someone underestimated her. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, voice steady but calm, "but I was under the impression this was a courtroom, not a fashion tribunal." A few murmurs fluttered around the room, the kind of whispers that come when people aren't sure whether to be impressed or appalled. Judge Fenwick's mouth twisted, just slightly. "You can pay the contempt fine at the clerk's desk. This court does not permit religious displays in trial hearings." "I'm not on trial," she replied evenly, hands still resting in her lap. "Today you are," he snapped. A man in the back, middle-aged, white, anxious, shifted in his seat. That was Ted Moran, the man who had dragged Alice here over a contract dispute involving a local tutoring business. Nothing criminal, nothing flashy, but the moment Alice stepped into that room, everything became heavier. Ted had come in with a cheap navy tie and that air of small-town confidence. He knew the judge, knew the court clerk, knew the bailiff by his first name. He'd assumed this hearing would last all of 20 minutes and end with a polite handshake and maybe a quiet smirk. He hadn't counted on Alice. Alice, who was there not as a witness, not as a client, but as her own legal representation. She sat beside the defense table, no lawyer at her side, just a thick leather folder, a simple pen, and a battered notepad filled with pages that didn't look like notes, more like strategy. This wasn't her first courtroom, but it might be the first where someone dared to fine her for a necklace. Across the aisle, a young black girl sat silently, maybe 19. She kept glancing at Alice like she was watching something sacred. Like Alice being in that courtroom meant something more than just a legal win, a kind of permission, a kind of proof. Fenwick banged the gavel again. "This is your final warning. Next time you'll be removed." Alice nodded, but didn't break her gaze. "I understand, Your Honor." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for everyone to feel it. Then she opened her folder. Her voice didn't rise, her tone didn't tremble, but the courtroom adjusted. Chairs straightened, pens stopped moving. She began to speak with the crisp, deliberate cadence of someone who had spent more time teaching than talking. "Before we begin, I'd like to enter a preliminary motion regarding jurisdiction and conflict of interest, on account of Mr. Moran's documented relationship with the court officer who notarized our original agreement." Fenwick blinked. "I wasn't informed of such a motion." "It's in the packet I filed last Tuesday. Page 7, bottom paragraph, highlighted in yellow." The clerk rifled through papers. Found it. Judge Fenwick's fingers tapped against the bench, a signal, impatience, maybe, or maybe nerves. He glanced at Ted. Ted looked like he'd swallowed a throatful of gravel. Alice kept going, calm, methodical. Her hands didn't shake when she handed over her exhibits. They didn't fumble when she walked through emails, tax records, and signed documents. She didn't raise her voice even when Fenwick interrupted her. Twice. She just waited, listened, then leaned back in her chair like she had all the time in the world. What no one in that courtroom knew, not the bailiff, not Ted, not even Fenwick, was that Alice Clinton had passed the bar 6 years ago, that she had published legal research papers under a pseudonym, that she had turned down job offers from some of the biggest firms in the city because she had her own reasons, her own plan, her own way of doing things. She didn't advertise her credentials. She didn't announce her titles. She let people guess. And most of the time, they guessed wrong. They saw the gold cross, the dark skin, the soft-spoken demeanor, and decided she must be out of place. Ted was staring at her now like she had grown a second head. The judge flipped pages, then finally sighed. "This document you submitted, I see no legal conflict, but I will recuse the notary's testimony from the record," he said stiffly. Alice offered a polite nod. "That will be sufficient." The judge tried to move on, tried to regain control. But something had shifted. The room wasn't on his side anymore. Not fully. Even the bailiff, stoic and still, looked curious now. Ted's lawyer, a young man with slick hair and too many bullet points, began his opening statement. Alice listened quietly, eyes steady, pen moving just enough to draw small circles in the margin of her pad. She didn't object. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The rhythm of the courtroom had already shifted. It had aligned with her. By the time the judge called for a 5-minute recess, Ted's posture had collapsed into something fragile. Alice didn't stand. She didn't go to the restroom or stretch her legs. She just sat still, flipping slowly through a folder labeled "Contracts and Misconduct," annotated. And that girl in the gallery, the one who'd been watching with wide, hopeful eyes, she was smiling now. Like maybe for the first time, she understood what power could look like when wrapped in grace. And Alice, she just kept turning the page. When the recess ended, the courtroom filtered back in with the quiet shuffling of feet and hushed murmurs. There was something different in the way people moved now, as if the gravity of what they had just witnessed hadn't fully settled, but its weight was beginning to press. Ted Moran re-entered with noticeably less swagger. His tie was looser, the color of his face a little less smug. He muttered something to his lawyer, who now looked like he was reconsidering every tactic he had prepped the night before. No one said it aloud, but the energy had shifted. Alice Clinton wasn't just a woman in a courtroom anymore. Judge Fenwick cleared his throat and adjusted his robe like he, too, felt it. An authority he had taken for granted suddenly wasn't stretching as far across the bench as it usually did. He tapped his pen once, a small, sharp sound, and looked directly at Alice. "Miss Clinton, are you prepared to give your opening?" She stood slowly, smoothed her suit jacket, and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't use a slideshow, didn't raise her voice, didn't pace the floor like some showy defense lawyer on television. Instead, she walked to the center of the courtroom, hands clasped in front of her, and began to speak with a calm that was nearly surgical. "When Mr. Moran approached me about helping him expand his tutoring business, he presented himself as someone who cared about education, about access, about giving underserved students a real chance. I believed him." She paused. "But beliefs aren't contracts. Words are not agreements. And when someone tries to profit from your silence, when they rewrite your work and call it theirs, that's not partnership. That's theft." The silence in the room thickened. "I have no desire to tarnish anyone's name, but I do have a right to protect mine." She returned to her seat, leaving those words hanging in the air like smoke. Ted's lawyer stood up with a cautious kind of urgency. He attempted to counter, framing Alice as a passionate volunteer who misinterpreted a business conversation. He used words like emotional, informal, and misunderstanding. The longer he talked, the less sure he sounded, because every point he made felt like it bounced off of something harder than logic, something undeniable. Evidence, because Alice had brought it. Emails with timestamps, voicemail transcriptions, payment receipts that stopped just days after Ted received grant funding based on lesson plans Alice had written, proposals Alice had edited, and a mission Alice had carried on her own shoulders for nearly 2 years. The defense team tried to pivot, arguing that Alice's involvement had never been formalized, that she had never signed a partnership agreement. Alice didn't flinch. She simply reached into her folder and pulled out a printed email chain, slid it across the table, and waited. Ted's lawyer looked down. It was dated 9 months prior. The subject line read, "Drafting Final Terms. Alice/Ted Partnership Proposal." And there, in black and white, was Ted's name, affirming her role, confirming her authorship, and promising an official contract to be drawn once funding came through. The lawyer's jaw tensed. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Moran," Fenwick said dryly, "did you or did you not send this email?" Ted leaned into the mic, voice strained. "I did, Your Honor, but it was... That's all I needed, thank you." Alice looked at neither of them. She just made a note with her pen and folded her hands again, like she had all the time in the world. The gallery remained quiet, but there was a new energy in the air now. You could feel it. Like everyone was trying to recalibrate what they thought they knew about her, what she was capable of. One by one, those assumptions that once felt solid were dissolving right in front of them. Ted's lawyer launched into a half-hearted objection, arguing the chain was informal, exploratory, not legally binding. "That may be so," Fenwick responded, "but it's highly relevant to the credibility of the defendant's claim. Continue." They did, but with less heat, less momentum. The fire was gone. Alice listened, her expression unchanging, like a professor watching a student fumble a midterm essay, calm but knowing. When it was her turn to speak again, she didn't grandstand, she didn't raise her voice, she just leaned forward slightly, looking down at her notes, and said, "I don't need this court to paint me as a victim. I'm not one. But I do need this court to acknowledge that my work, my time, my ideas have value, that I am not invisible just because I chose not to scream." A pause. "And if my quiet presence makes people uncomfortable, that says more about what they expect from me than what I actually am." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed like soft blows. Gentle, but pointed. The judge looked at her longer than was necessary. "I've heard enough for today," he said finally. "Court will recess until tomorrow at 10 a.m., when we'll hear closing arguments." As people stood, rustling their papers and bags, a voice from the gallery spoke out. Soft but clear. "Miss Clinton." It was Jasmine, the young girl who hadn't missed a second. "Are you a lawyer?" The room froze for just a breath. Alice turned her head slowly toward the voice, her expression almost surprised. Then she gave a small nod. "I am." A smile flickered across Jasmine's face like sunlight breaking through leaves. And in that tiny smile, in that small acknowledgement, something began to bloom. Something Alice recognized, because she'd once carried it too. Hope. As Alice packed up her folder and stood to leave, the weight of the courtroom didn't press down on her anymore. It seemed to lift just slightly, as if even the walls had begun to understand that the woman standing in front of them was not to be underestimated again. The bailiff opened the door. The judge watched her go. Ted didn't say a word. And Alice Clinton, quiet and composed, walked out, not like someone escaping the heat, but like someone who had just turned it all back around. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of shifting expectations. No one dared speak too loud, yet the unspoken commentary filled the room like thick humidity. Somewhere between the lines of exhibits and objections, people had stopped seeing Alice Clinton as a defendant, or even as a woman clinging to a necklace the court didn't like. She had become the anchor of the room. Ted sat with his shoulders pressed forward now, like he was shrinking into himself, trying not to be noticed. His attorney tapped a pen against the desk, his previous confidence slowly disintegrating with each new piece of evidence Alice produced. Not loud evidence, not sensational, just facts. Stacked neatly, chronologically, and each one leading to a single, irrefutable point. She had built the business Ted took credit for. Judge Fenwick had barely spoken since the lunch recess. His eyes, once sharp and quick to correct, now drifted to Alice with a quiet curiosity. He watched her movements, her calm, her methodical language. He was listening now, truly listening, though he didn't seem ready to admit that something in him had shifted. Alice stood again, this time with a small USB in hand. "Your Honor," she said, "with your permission, I'd like to submit a short audio file recorded 3 months ago. It was shared with Mr. Moran for training purposes. He consented to it being recorded and distributed as part of our onboarding materials." The judge gave a curt nod. "Proceed." The clerk plugged in the USB, and a few seconds later the courtroom filled with the soft but unmistakable sound of Ted Moran's voice. "Alice built the whole thing, honestly. I just helped shape it. The strategy, the pitch. We wouldn't have made it past phase 1 without her proposals." There was laughter in the recording. Ted's, relaxed and self-satisfied. But people like a certain image. And let's face it, funders open more doors when someone like me is standing in front of them. You get what I mean? The audio stopped. No one moved. Not the jurors, not the clerk, not even Ted's attorney. Alice didn't gloat, didn't smile. She merely clicked her pen and continued with her notes. She was not here for revenge. She was here for recognition, and recognition didn't require applause. It only required truth. Judge Fenwick coughed into his hand. "Is that the entirety of the clip?" "Yes, Your Honor." Ted's lawyer asked to confer. He leaned into Ted, whispering harshly. Ted responded, first with denial, then visible panic. His hands moved in jerky patterns, trying to undo something with gestures that couldn't erase what had been recorded. Across the gallery, someone muttered under their breath, "Damn." Alice remained seated, watching the conversation unfold like someone watching the tide come in. Inevitable, steady. No matter how loud people yelled, the ocean still came forward 1 inch at a time. The judge called both sides forward. Alice approached the bench, standing to the left of Ted and his lawyer, her folders still pressed to her chest, like a shield made of dignity. "Mr. Moran," Fenwick began slowly, his voice carrying the weight of old-school decorum. "This court does not take lightly the idea of fraud or misrepresentation. However, this is still a civil hearing. Let's stay focused." Alice looked straight ahead, eyes unblinking. "Miss Clinton," he continued, "do you have a remedy you're seeking beyond financial compensation?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'm asking that my name be restored to the grant documentation, that the educational materials I authored be attributed properly in all future use, and that Mr. Moran cease distributing or presenting them as his original work." "You're not pursuing damages?" "I'm not interested in money," she said simply. "I'm interested in integrity." There was a pause. Real, full, uncomfortable. "Very well. That request will be reviewed." The judge turned back toward the rest of the courtroom. "Recess until 3:45. We'll reconvene for final statements." Alice returned to her seat. Ted didn't. He stood there a moment longer than needed, like his legs hadn't quite caught up to the realization that he was no longer the man he pretended to be when the day started. He looked down at Alice. She didn't look back. Out in the hallway, the temperature shifted from tense to electric. Alice stepped into a quiet corridor, needing air more than space. Her heels tapped softly against the linoleum tiles as she leaned her back against the cool brick wall. The courthouse windows cast long shadows. Light filtered in uneven slants, streaking her skin with gold and gray. Behind her, the door opened. Soft footsteps approached. It was the young black girl from the gallery. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but I just wanted to say thank you." Alice turned, one brow lifted gently. "For what?" "For not letting him talk over you. For wearing your cross anyway. For not folding." Alice gave a small, quiet smile. "What's your name?" "Jasmine." "Well, Jasmine," Alice said, "if you ever find yourself in a room where they make you feel small, Don't fight them by shouting louder. Let them shrink under the weight of their own underestimation. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She just nodded, eyes gleaming with something between hope and awe. Alice adjusted her folder, stepped away from the wall, and offered Jasmine the tiniest nod of her head before walking back toward the courtroom. Her steps were slow, not because she was uncertain, but because the moment required something deliberate. In a world that often demanded urgency, dignity walked. When she entered the courtroom again, people noticed. Even the stenographer straightened in her seat. And Judge Fenwick, perhaps for the first time all day, watched Alice Clinton not as a nuisance, not as a disruption, but as a presence, something immovable, something that belonged. The second act of this trial was about to end, but no one in the room felt closure just yet. They were all waiting to see how it would end, and whether the woman with the gold cross and unshakable calm would do more than just win her case. The final stretch of daylight filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long golden lines across the hardwood floors. It was the kind of light that made things feel softer, even when nothing about the moment was gentle. The courtroom had filled again, but the restless tension from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter. It was the stillness of people waiting to witness a shift, waiting to see whether this story, the one they hadn't expected to be pulled into, was going to end the way it should. Alice Clinton sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly, her folder now closed. She didn't need it anymore. Everything she had brought to the table had already been spoken, shown, proven. The weight of it sat in the silence like a living thing. Judge Fenwick looked tired, not exhausted, but different, as though something inside him had been turned, like a key unlocking a door that had long since rusted shut. He shuffled a few papers in front of him, cleared his throat, and looked down over the bench at Alice and Ted. Both parties have made their final statements. I've reviewed the filings, the documentation, and the audio presented earlier. He paused, and his eyes flickered briefly toward Alice before moving away, toward the ceiling, as if he needed a moment to gather whatever integrity he had left. This court finds in favor of Miss Alice Clinton. There was a hush, and then a beat of breath, like the room had collectively remembered it was allowed to exhale. In addition to reimbursement of all incurred costs, Fenwick continued, this court grants Miss Clinton's request for attribution on all grant-funded documents and curriculum developed during the disputed period. Furthermore, Mr. Moran is ordered to cease distribution of any material derived from Miss Clinton's original intellectual property unless proper credit is given. Ted's mouth hung open slightly. His attorney leaned back in his chair like someone had just pulled the floor out from under his day. Fenwick's gaze returned to Alice, and for once it wasn't guarded. It wasn't performative. It was simply present. Miss Clinton, he said slowly, while this court took issue with your courtroom decorum earlier, I will acknowledge that substance often reveals itself more quietly than volume. You've made your case with clarity, evidence, and restraint. This court respects your diligence. Alice stood softly. Thank you, Your Honor. The words weren't dramatic. No victory speech. No gloating. Just calm grace, the same way she had entered the courtroom that morning. Measured, certain, whole. Judge Fenwick banged the gavel once. Court is adjourned. Chairs scraped the floor as people began to rise, some slower than others, like they didn't quite want to leave yet, like they'd witnessed something they weren't ready to walk away from. Ted stood but didn't move. His eyes met Alice's briefly, then dropped to the ground. She didn't return the look. She had no interest in gloating. The victory wasn't about him. It never was. As she turned to gather her things, someone clapped once, then again. It was awkward, hesitant, until others joined in. Alice turned, startled. The courtroom, a place known for silence and separation, had erupted in a ripple of quiet, respectful applause. Not thunderous, not showy, but real. Jasmine stood up first, hands pressed together. Others followed. Even the court reporter clapped once, before returning to her papers. Alice gave the smallest smile. Just enough. Then she walked out of the courtroom. Not faster, not slower, just the same way she had walked in. On her own 2 feet, wearing the cross. Outside, the courthouse steps were warm under the afternoon sun. She paused there, letting the light hit her full on. The city hummed around her, but her thoughts were calm. As she descended the steps, Jasmine rushed up beside her. "Miss Clinton." Alice turned. "You didn't just win in there," Jasmine said, breathless but smiling wide. "You made all of us feel like we could win too." Alice tilted her head, touched by the sincerity. "I hope you never need a courtroom to prove that," she said. "But if you do, make sure you walk in with your name, your truth, and your shoulders back." Jasmine nodded, wiping at her eyes. Do you take interns?" Alice chuckled lightly. "I take learners," she said, "and I teach by letting them fight their own battles." "I can fight," Jasmine said, eyes lit up. "I just need someone to show me how to aim." Alice reached into her bag and handed Jasmine a small business card. "Start here." Behind them, the courthouse doors swung open and closed, people spilling out with the lightness of an unexpected ending. Not just because a judgment had been passed, but because something right had been done. A correction, a course realigned. Ted exited later, flanked by his lawyer, both moving quickly, their faces low. There would be no applause for them. Only headlines, only slow realizations. But Alice didn't see them go. She was already halfway down the sidewalk, folder tucked under one arm, purse across her shoulder, her phone buzzing softly in her bag with messages she hadn't read yet. Some from friends who were watching, others from people she hadn't heard from in years. And one from a local university that had seen the case transcript as it streamed online. An offer to speak at their upcoming law and ethics seminar. She'd consider it. But not now. Now she wanted quiet, wanted tea, wanted to sit beneath the magnolia tree in her neighborhood park, the one that always bloomed too early and dropped petals like soft confetti. That space had always been hers. That, and the knowledge that winning didn't always come in the form of cheers. Sometimes it was just the sound of your own footsteps leaving a place you never belonged in the first place. With your dignity untouched, Alice walked on. The gold cross still rested on her chest, a glimmer of something sacred in the sunlight. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't just feel seen. She felt understood.